Mr. Carpenter, welcome to the Border Zone again. And it's very important for me to have you in this program today because last month, Russian propaganda media was stating that you are the part of Gavrilov's night. We call it Gavrilov's night, when Russian State Duma representative was asked to leave the country. When you came here the last time to the conference, first of all, did Mr. Saakashvili invite you? It is the first question because it's a message distributed in Russian media. The second question, do you have anything related to this Gavrilov visit?
So clearly, the Russian propaganda is going into overtime about my role in these events. I haven't spoken with former President Saakashvili in years. Obviously, I was invited not by him, but by the University of Georgia to participate in a conference on Russia's political and economic influence here in Georgia. So that's what I talked about, naturally. I left the country before the Gavrilov protests began, but this is exactly the sort of fake disinformation that the Russian propaganda machine wants to plant. And they do it very insidiously by saying things like, well, Mike Carpenter, former Pentagon official, just happened to be in Georgia the week before it happened, and then insinuating all kinds of evil things on my behalf.
So it was not your goal to provoke any kind of activities in Georgia?
As if I had the power to convince the Georgian people to protest against the fact that their country is being occupied. It's just so ludicrous on its face that I could convince an entire population of people that lives under occupation each and every day and suffers from it. It's crazy, but this is exactly the sort of stuff they try to, I think, more for their own population in Russia than for here in Georgia.
For sure. You came in a very difficult period again. We have provocations on the so-called border with South Ossetia for a month. And actually, it's very dangerous. The situation is tense. What will be, because it's a never-ending story. We don't see any end. And actually, we see 1.5 kilometers of Georgian territory occupied again week before. So do you have any understanding of how it could be, I don't know, solved or at least countered by Georgian government, by international community? These statements, is there any sense in these statements from DC or Europe?
Well, first of all, what is the Russian aim here with this? It's clearly there's a strategic goal behind this borderization policy. It's to try to communicate to the Georgian people that do whatever they like, Russia will control them at the end of the day. Russia can do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. That's the message. And when the international community is silent the way it is, issuing a meek little statement from an embassy here or there without any follow-up, policy-wise, without any consequences, without any real leverage being applied against Moscow, of course they're going to continue with this. It's funny how this issue has fallen into a vacuum compared to what happens in Donbass or what happens elsewhere. And we should continue to highlight what happens in Ukraine. But this is an important issue, and facts are happening on the ground. People's homes are being destroyed, their livelihoods are being destroyed, and it merits just a simple statement from the embassy here or from a couple officials in Europe. That's not going to be enough.
According to your understanding, why sanctions are not on the table in regard with Georgia? We have it in regard with Ukraine, but Georgia is not in the list, never.
It's a very good question. And the reason has to do with the fact that sanctions were never contemplated in the aftermath of the 2008 war, which is a big mistake, I think, on the part of both the United States and the European Union.
So it couldn't be discussed now.
But it could be discussed now. That's the point. Unfortunately, we have this process, the Geneva discussions, which sort of provide the illusion of a process to resolve the war and the conflict. But in fact, they don't do anything other than provide that illusion. And so that takes the energy away from a discussion, which is where it rightly should be, on whether to apply sanctions or other types of pressure on Russia.
What should be done to put this sanctions, for example, topic on the table in Washington, D.C.? What should be done? I don't know.
First of all, the issue needs to be elevated. It needs to be elevated by the government here. They need to make an issue of this, not in Geneva, but in Western capitals. And then, the United States and Germany and France and the UK, they also need to pick this up and be seized with this issue.
According to your understanding, it's not taking place at the moment. I mean, such kind of job from government of Georgia and DC.
Well, it starts, well, it has to be so I'll put it this way. The embassy of the government of Georgia in DC does talk about this issue and does raise it and does send out alerts to people about what's happening on the ground. But in order for the issue to have resonance, it needs to be a political issue. It needs to be one that is raised as one of the first points in any discussion between governments. And then it'll have more traction.
It is not.
To my understanding, well, I'm not in government anymore,
Yeah,
but to my understanding, this is not being raised with the same level of intensity as, say, Ukraine raises issues with regards to what's happening in the Donbass or Crimea.
Don't you think that such kind of silence, let's say, on behalf of, yeah, there were some statements from State Department, but anyway, no concrete actions against this aggression in Georgia, is it connected anyway with the policy of White House? For example, the last statement of President Trump about getting back Mr. Putin to J8, J7. Yeah. So is it connected?
Clearly, it is connected because this administration under Trump does not want to antagonize Russia. Just to the contrary, as you pointed out, they want to appease the Putin regime. They want to bring Russia back into the G8 without any preconditions. Trump has also suspended now U.S. military assistance to Ukraine for unknown reasons. And so they're going soft on Russia, clearly at a time where Russia is becoming more aggressive. And so, yes, these two things are linked. Maybe the embassy here is doing the right thing, and they're not aware entirely of what the discussions are within the White House, but clearly this is part of a coordinated strategy.
Is it relations between Russia and the United States of America, what we discuss, or only Trump administration and Vladimir Putin?
Well, that's
a position of United States?
It's a very good question because these are the sorts of issues that, for example, led to the resignation of Jim Mattis from the Pentagon. The fact that the U.S. is not standing more firmly with our allies. But it is clearly an issue of Donald Trump, and it is an issue of his inner circle within the White House. And they control government. So if the other agencies of government are not on board, if Secretary Pompeo is not on board, then he could face the same fate as Rex Tillerson.
Would you say that at the moment relations between Russia and the United States are, I don't know, better, good, normal, where, I don't know, it's going to be normal or something like this positive?
No. Actually, relations between Russia and the United States are tense. If you look at opinion polls, U.S. opinion of the Putin regime, Russian opinion of the United States, except among Russian youth. Russian youth actually have very high opinions of the United States, something like 60% of 18 to 25-year-olds. But overall, the opinions are bad. The rhetoric is, especially in Moscow, but also in the U.S., is fairly heated. So despite Trump's attempts to appease Putin, the underlying realities are that the relationship is quite tense.
And in regard with this last change of arrested people from Ukraine and Russia that happened just 2 days ago, how is it considered on the West in the United States? Is it some kind of, I don't know, better behavior of Vladimir Putin, or they understand that it was just some political tool he used in Ukraine?
It depends who you talk to. I'm very glad the exchange happened because I'm happy for the families of those who were imprisoned. But, I'm not naive that this is going to lead to some sort of end of the war. I think there are some who are clinging to that belief. And I think from Trump's perspective, he clearly, through his tweets and through his statements on this, has shown that he wants for Ukraine to do a deal with Russia. I don't see the leverage in place. I don't see the dynamics there to lead to a resolution, but that's what the Trump administration would love for the issue of the Donbass to go away.
Could it be some good step for relations to move forward? I mean, U.S. and Russia.
Look, if the conflict in the Donbass were resolved such that Russian troops withdrew and there was an amicable agreement to say, for example, give equal rights to the Russian language, I would be all in favor. That would be wonderful. But if we're talking about an agreement where the occupied parts of the Donbass turn into something like Republika Srpska in Bosnia, that is not an agreement that will protect Ukraine's sovereignty.
But the question is, Vladimir Putin is called, I don't know, criminal. He's like persecuted on the West for some killings in Great Britain and Germany a few weeks ago, and etc. And the West call him terrorist from time to time. I mean, Russian government. So is it possible, even if the conflict on Donbass will be resolved, to get back to some normal relations between the West and Vladimir Putin?
Well, I would put it this way. The conflict in the Donbass is the key to the improvement of the West's relations with Russia, as it should be. But again, I'm very skeptical that we're anywhere near a resolution to that conflict. So if we hypothetically got to that scenario where we were able to resolve this and protect Ukraine's sovereignty, then in fact, I would be the first person to advocate for lifting some sanctions on Russia. But we're just not anywhere near that point.
Understood. I think the last question, how do you evaluate the current activities in Russia? I think you checked the news about elections in Moscow and other cities, and we see there that some oppositional representative won and take in charge in Moscow Duma,
Yes.
Moscow City Duma. So is it some kind of, in parallel with these prisoners, is it connected? And can we say that Russian regime, Vladimir Putin, is trying to show his, democratic change in his mind? I mean, elections, prisoners, and etc.
I think they're connected in the sense that Putin pays a lot of attention to opinion polls and what people think. And clearly having the Ukrainian sailors captive was not an issue that most Russians supported. And so I think it was easy politically for him to make this big gesture of goodwill, so to speak. But in terms of the elections, look, I mean, there were no concessions made in terms of the elections. These were not democratic elections. Most of the candidates from the opposition were not allowed to participate. The fact that some won election to the Moscow Duma and the fact that so many people in Moscow voted against Единая Россия, against the United Russia Party, is heartening because it shows that young people, especially in the big cities, are sick and tired of this regime and they want to vote for other alternatives, but the system is stacked against them. But it's civil society that is still very strong and expressing its opinions.
We're now in Tbilisi, Georgia, and as my last question, we say that Russian government is occupying the country. We see the creeping occupation. We see all the human rights violations and etc. How do you evaluate current situation in Georgia in regard with democratic movement development? And we talked already a little about Anatlia port, but all persecution against Mr. Khazaradze, one of the leaders of this project, are still in action, and he has some law problems. How do you evaluate current situation in this country?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't focus on specifics, but if you look at the big picture, you look at the fact that some of the major independent TV stations are now changing ownership. There's less pluralism in broadcast TV. If you look at the judiciary, unfortunately, the problems persist with allegations of corruption and of political motivation in terms of some of the cases that are brought to the Georgian courts. And so if you look at democratic development, there's a number of serious issues. Not issues that are new to Georgia. These are issues that have been there in the past, but that combined, the effect could be such that, we could see a worrying trend in the future. And so I think it's incumbent on the West to monitor very closely democratic developments here because, we're worried about the institution, not just in Georgia, we're worried in other places too. But here, some of these trend lines, media, judiciary especially, are ones that are concerning.
What exactly could be done to make the West, the Western community, talk more about Georgia and its problems? Because I don't see that it's on the table like in many capitals. I don't mean the government, maybe some other tools.
Well, I wish that conferences like this one are one way to highlight this issue. I wish there was more attention to this. The fact that you have the State Department so understaffed now, we don't have an acting assistant secretary, we don't in the Pentagon either for this region, that's Senate confirmed. That doesn't help, but more political attention needs to be focused. I would love for more members of Congress to come here and see with their own eyes what's happening, both in the Skin Valley region on the administrative boundary line, but also in terms of the internal developments here.
There is no any tool United States, for example, could do in reality, providing more weapon or do practically in regard with occupation.
Well, yes, there is. I mean, we launched a huge defense training and readiness program with the Georgian military back when I was in the Pentagon. It continues to this day, and we could be building on that by doing more, by expanding it, by providing.
But it's not stopping the Kremlin from going further.
No, and that will require a significant escalation of costs. So this, what Russia sees in terms of military to military cooperation here in Georgia, it does not like. And that's a form of consequence or cost, if you like. But in addition to that, you have to really think about some sanctions tools, other types of tools that would impose costs for the continuing aggression, especially on the administrative boundary line.
Understood. Thanks a lot, and thank you again for coming to Georgia. And I hope that in 3 days, as it was before, we will not be blamed for some activities in Georgia against occupation.
I won't say we won't be. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.